they threatened to take my family away from me. So at that point, I'm doing what I can to protect my family.
These dirty cops claim to protect people by the law, but they're the ones we need protection from.
Tonight, a former Pentagon police officer is facing more than 2 decades behind bars for a deadly double shooting in Montgomery County.
This is David Dixon, a former Pentagon police officer. In April 2021, he shot and killed 2 men in the parking lot of his building. He was in the parking lot of his Maryland apartment complex when he reportedly saw these men breaking into a car. He was off duty when he shot at 3 men who he claimed were trying to steal a car. He shot 32-year-old Dominic Williams and 38-year-old James Lionel Johnson while they were trying to escape with a car they had broken into. A third man named Michael Thomas survived the shooting and became a witness in the case. Dixon claimed that he shot in self-defense because the burglars were driving towards him. However, video evidence showed that Dixon shot them after the car passed him, and there was no threat to his life. The man who survived said that Dixon had shot without any form of justification, especially as he was off duty. He would have gotten off with a lighter sentence if he hadn't shot them as a form of stopping them from stealing the car. His attorney said that he did a heroic act because he stopped the burglars from stealing the car. The only survivor admitted to stealing the car on a 911 call after he drove away from the scene of the shooting. This wasn't Dixon's only example of a trigger-happy mentality. In 2020, he pointed a rifle at a homeless woman who was wearing flip-flops in the lobby of his building. He wasn't charged for this offense. Dixon was sentenced to 25 years in prison for his actions, and before he was let away, he apologized for his actions. He told the court that he instinctively reacted, according to his training, but that he was remorseful for what he did. If what David Dixon did shocks you, wait until you hear about the brutal crimes that Wayne Couzens committed because he had a police belt and badge to aid him.
A wholly blameless victim of grotesquely executed crimes. Sarah Everard's final hours said the judge as bleak and agonizing as it's possible to imagine.
In the case of Wayne Couzens, you would not expect what he did under the umbrella of being a cop. It will chill you to your bones. Wayne was a metropolitan officer who was arrested and suspected of kidnapping and murder. In South London, England, 33-year-old Sarah Everard was kidnapped on the 3rd of March, 2021. She had been walking home from a friend's house without knowing she was being followed by a white car. This car had been rented by Couzens from a dealership earlier that morning in Kent. Dashcam footage showed Couzens parking near Sarah and the 2 standing beside the car. As it turns out, Couzens showed Sarah his police warrant card before handcuffing her and pretending to arrest her for breaching COVID-19 guidelines. The next time the car was spotted, it was captured by CCTV around Kent. Later that night, it is believed that Couzens transferred Sarah to a different car in Shepherdswell and her there. After doing this, he strangled her with his police duty belt. The next time he was seen, Couzens had once again switched to his rental car and drove to a gas station where he was seen buying gas, big builder bags, and duct tape. It seemed like he decided to get rid of Sarah. Couzens then burnt Sarah's body in a refrigerator and dumped her remains in a pond near Couzens' part of his family's property in Hodes Wood, Ashford. On the 8th of March, Couzens turned in his handcuffs and police belt after saying he was suffering from stress. He was arrested on the 9th of March because he was the last person who saw Sarah. She had called her boyfriend before Couzens kidnapped and murdered her. Her boyfriend contacted the police and the search identified Couzens as the primary suspect in her murder.
I'll show you a picture. Do you know Sarah?
I don't know.
Okay.
For a while, Couzens repeatedly denied ever having interactions with Sarah, even though they showed him a picture of the victim. The officers in charge of the investigation were convinced that Wayne was their culprit, so they pressed further. What Couzens said after their persistence would shock you.
I am in financial and I've been lent on by I don't know who they are. They're a group, a gang, whatever, and they told me, right, I need to go and pick up girls and give them to them.
Couzens claimed that he had paid for sex in Folkestone, and as payment, a gang of Eastern Europeans had threatened to harm his family. unless he gave them another girl because he had underpaid a sex worker a few weeks before kidnapping Sarah. He claimed that this was the reason he had kidnapped Sarah, so he could hand her over to the gang. He didn't give any defined answers to any of the questions he was asked about how the gang contacted him.
They threatened to take my family away from me. So, at that point, I'm doing what I can to protect my family.
Eventually, Couzens confessed to kidnapping and murdering Sarah Everard on June 8, 2021. He was sentenced in September to life in prison with the tariff of a whole life order, meaning there was no way he would ever be released from jail. Couzens also received an extra 19 months for a previous offense of indecent exposure. The judge who sentenced Couzens said that the murder of Sarah would have been prevented if the previous sexual offenses of Couzens had been taken seriously. Couzens was said to be shaking as his sentence was read, but video evidence was never provided. As a result of this brutal murder, the Met announced that they would stop deploying lone police officers in plain clothing. Wayne Couzens' case was shocking, but nothing will make you lose faith in the law enforcement agencies faster than the horrific actions of a group of cops called the Goon Squad.
In the last hour, 6 former Mississippi officers were sentenced to 15 to 45 years in prison on state charges in the assault and torture of 2 black men. The officers pleaded guilty to charges including hindering prosecution, burglary, home invasion, and aggravated assault.
These 6 men you just saw called themselves the Goon Squad, and it is shocking that such a name is used for a group of law enforcement officers. These 6 committed a series of crimes that would make your blood boil.
5 former deputies and 1 police officer entered this home, no warrant, no evidence that anything was happening there. And they proceeded to torture these men for hours using food, at one point a sex toy, and threatening an execution.
On January 24th, 2023 in Mississippi, these 6 men brutally tortured 2 men named Michael Jenkins and Eddie Parker in some of the most heinous ways possible. Brett McAlpin, Hunter Elward, Christian Dedman, Jeffrey Middleton, Daniel Opdyke, and Joshua Hartfield tortured the men for over an hour and a half. The officers, who referred to themselves as the Goon Squad, went to the area after receiving a report that Jenkins and Parker had entered a home with a white woman. The home belonged to Christy Wally, a childhood friend of Parker who had been paralyzed, and Parker was her caretaker. The Goon Squad broke down the front door and immediately restrained Parker and Jenkins without a search warrant. Wally was in the hospital when this horrific incident happened. The Goon Squad referred to Jenkins and Parker with slurs and insults while beating and torturing the men. Opdyke found a sex toy in the house and forced it into Parker's mouth. Another of the officers, Christian Dedman, threatened to the men, and he attempted until he realized that Jenkins had defecated on himself. If you thought that was all, you're wrong. Elward held the 2 men down and watched as Dedman poured cooking oil, eggs, chocolate syrup, and milk, among other kitchen ingredients, on them. Hartfield also used a taser on the 2 men while they were tied up. Jenkins and Parker were beaten with a plank and a sword during the torture. After these horrible officers had their fill of torturing the 2 men, they ordered them to take a shower to hide the evidence of the torture they went through for almost 2 hours. Unfortunately for the victims, it wasn't over. Elward forced his gun into Jenkins' mouth and shot him even though he failed the first time. The bullet tore through the victim's mouth, broke his jaw, and came out of his neck. Before the Goon Squad left, they planted a gun and drugs in the home and accused Jenkins of trying to shoot at them first. They took security footage from the house and threw it into a river. The Goon Squad pleaded guilty to all counts of felonies, deprivation of rights under color of law, and obstruction of justice, among other counts. During the investigation, the lead attorney, Malik Shabazz, said that it was one of the worst things he had ever come across. The time for sentencing came, and it was a long and overdue process. Although the Goon Squad pleaded guilty in August 2022, they weren't sentenced until March 2024. The Goon Squad displayed a variety of reactions as their sentences were read. The man who was regarded as the mafia don of the group, Brett McAlpin, was sentenced to more than 27 years in prison, and his voice was said to be shaking as he addressed the court. The victims described him as a tyrant or a king because he walked around and instructed the other deputies on what to do while they were being tortured. The members of the Goon Squad also said that the squad would not even exist if it wasn't for McAlpin. He apologized for his actions, but it didn't count with the victims because he had been the reason that the other members came to the Braxton home that day. Daniel Opdyke was sentenced to 17 years in prison, and while he addressed the court, he cried profusely and was very emotional as he delivered his speech. He apologized for sexually assaulting Jenkins, but the victim walked out of the courtroom with his aunt. He pleaded that the reason he was this way was because he had been sexually assaulted by his father until he was 8 years old. He was also responsible for handing over the evidence of the Goon Squad group chat on WhatsApp to the police. After apologizing, he was led away in chains as he wept out of the courtroom. Elward, who had shot Jenkins in the mouth, was sentenced to 20 years, and he also gave an emotional apology to the victims for shooting Jenkins and leaving him to bleed to death. Jeffrey Middleton was sentenced to 17.5 years for obstruction of justice and abuse of the victims. Joshua Hartfield was sentenced to 10 years because he participated in the torture. He was the only officer who wasn't a member of the Rankin County Sheriff's Department. The argument that was given was that the reason he participated was because he applied to work in Rankin. He used a taser on the victims and tried to destroy evidence. He choked and wept as he apologized for failing to help the people who needed him the most. The man who got the longest sentence was Christian Dedman. He was described as oppressive, sick, and the most sexually perverted of all the perpetrators for his actions. He threatened to rape the victims and poured multiple kitchen ingredients on them. Dedman was sentenced to 40 years in prison. He never addressed the victims directly, but he said that he would never forgive himself for the crimes he committed.
For, what, is given and what is done, I forgive that part, but other than that, he still did, what he did, and he has to be punished for that.
If I had to see them again, I would probably just start praying. I'd probably be scared out of my body.
Get ready for another gripping installment that will leave you on the edge of your seat in our next video, Most Dangerous Teens Reacting to Life Sentences.